Broncos Country. Today, we've got two big stories to talk about. And I'm telling you right now, they connect in a way that makes this final roster stretch a whole lot more interesting. The first one is all about the decisions Denver has to make before that 53-man roster is locked in. Because there are a few guys sitting right on that uncomfortable line where the Broncos could be forced to make a choice. Simply letting talent walk away for nothing might not be the smartest move. There could be another option on the table, and depending on what Denver decides, we could see some movement before everything is settled. But then we've got our second story, and this is where things get even more interesting. Because one AFC rival has been connected to the idea of potentially making a move involving Denver's roster. But there's a pretty strong reason why Sean Payton and the Broncos might look at that possibility and wonder why they would help another contender. So, we need to talk about both of these today, because roster cuts are coming. Trade conversations can change quickly, and every decision Denver makes right now could matter once the real games begin. And before we get into the first story, Broncos Country, if you enjoy talking Broncos like this with another fan, hit that like button and subscribe. This channel is still new, and we're chasing our first 1,000 subscribers. It would be awesome to have you here as one of the fans who can say you were part of this community right from the beginning. Alright, now let's get into this first story, because Denver has some decisions to make. So let's start with that first story, because this is where roster construction gets uncomfortable. The Broncos are getting closer to making those final decisions for the 53-man roster. And when you have real depth, sometimes the question isn't simply who deserves to stay. The question becomes whether Denver can get something back for a player instead of losing him for nothing. Bob Morris of Sports Illustrated's Mile High Huddle identified 3 Broncos players who could potentially have enough value for Denver to explore a trade rather than simply exposing them to waivers. Troy Franklin, Jaleel McLaughlin, and J.L. Skinner. And before anybody hears those names and immediately thinks all 3 guys are being traded, that is absolutely not what this means. This is about roster math, waiver rules, and trying to maximize the value of the players you have. Any player who hasn't accrued at least 4 NFL seasons is subject to waivers when released. That matters because Denver can't just cut certain players, automatically place them on the practice squad, and assume nobody else is going to touch them. Another team can claim them first. Waiver claims might not happen as frequently as fans sometimes imagine. And teams are often more interested in keeping their own recently undrafted rookies around for their practice squads. But players who already have meaningful NFL experience are different. Those are exactly the types of guys another team might look at and decide they already know what that player can do. If that team has a need, it could decide to claim him. And if you're a team sitting lower in the waiver priority, maybe you don't want to take that chance. Maybe you call Denver and offer something small just to guarantee that player becomes yours. That brings us to the biggest name of these 3, Troy Franklin. And man, this one is interesting. Franklin became a bigger part of Denver's offense last season. He was solid, but he didn't develop into the kind of major difference maker that would make his roster position completely untouchable. Now, the situation around him has changed. Denver added Jalen Waddle, and Pat Bryant has shown improvement this summer. Suddenly, Franklin finds himself in a much more crowded receiver room. And if Sean Payton ultimately decides he only wants 5 wide receivers on the 53-man roster, Denver has to determine exactly what it wants from that 5th spot. That's where Franklin's situation gets complicated. He can catch the football. He has NFL experience. There are absolutely teams around this league that could use additional receiving help. But versatility matters tremendously when you're fighting for one of those final roster spots. Franklin isn't giving Denver much as a blocker or on special teams. And when you're talking about your 4th or 5th receiver, those things can become extremely important. That doesn't mean Denver is definitely cutting Troy Franklin. In fact, releasing him would probably surprise a lot of people. But if the Broncos decide another receiver gives them more of what they need, Franklin could become a fascinating trade candidate because he likely has the most trade value of these 3 players. And personally, if Denver reaches a point where they know Franklin isn't making this roster, I don't want to watch them lose him for nothing if another team is willing to give something up. Even a late draft pick gives you another asset. And if somebody gets aggressive because they don't believe Franklin will reach them through waivers, even better. There's another possibility here too. Denver could potentially move on from Lil Jordan Humphrey and try to bring him back on the practice squad, while exposing other players to waivers who might have a better chance of clearing. That's why we have to remember that these decisions aren't made in isolation. It's not Troy Franklin versus nobody. It's Troy Franklin versus every other player Denver might want to use that roster spot on. And every other move Sean Payton believes gives this team the best chance to win. Then we get to Jaleel McLaughlin. And this one might be even easier to understand from a pure numbers perspective. Right now, it doesn't appear Denver is preparing to carry 4 running backs on the 53-man roster. If they only keep 3, McLaughlin is in a difficult position because the top 3 appear to be Dobbins, RJ Harvey, and Jonah Coleman. That is a crowded room. McLaughlin has done good things for this team. Broncos fans have seen the explosiveness and the ability he can bring with the football in his hands. But Dobbins, Harvey, and Coleman each offered Denver something that puts them ahead of McLaughlin in this current competition. And McLaughlin has only accrued 3 NFL seasons, meaning he would still have to go through waivers. So again, if Denver knows there isn't a roster spot available, why not at least make some phone calls? Nobody should expect some massive return here. The original analysis even points out that something like a 7th-round pick would still represent value for Denver. And think about that for a second. McLaughlin originally entered the league as an undrafted player. If Denver can develop an undrafted player, get production from him, and eventually turn him into a draft asset when the roster becomes too crowded to keep him, that's good roster management. You'd rather have a 7th-round pick than watch another team claim him and get absolutely nothing. Then there's J.L. Skinner. Skinner has managed to stick with Denver for the past 3 seasons, largely because of what he brings on special teams. But defensively, he hasn't established himself as the answer Denver appears to be looking for at that 3rd safety spot. And then Denver went out and signed Taylor Rapp. That move sends a pretty clear message about how the Broncos view their safety depth right now. And there's another factor working against Skinner when you start talking about special teams value. Devin Key is an All-Pro and has established himself as Denver's best special teams player. So when you combine the addition of Taylor Rapp, Skinner's limited defensive role, and Devin Key's importance on special teams, you start looking at the numbers and wondering whether there's actually enough room for Skinner. His trade market probably wouldn't be huge, but a team desperate for special teams help could potentially be interested in something like a day 3 draft pick swap. Again, that isn't some franchise-changing trade. But something is better than nothing if Denver has already decided the player isn't making the team. There was another name considered in this conversation as well, Drew Sanders. Under different circumstances, Sanders might have been capable of bringing back a draft pick. But his latest injury changes everything. After another health setback this summer, combined with his injury history, it becomes very difficult to imagine another team giving Denver meaningful compensation to acquire him right now. And that really brings us to the central point of this first story. Troy Franklin clearly has the most potential trade value of Franklin, McLaughlin, and Skinner. That does not mean Denver wants to trade Franklin. But if somebody calls with an offer Sean Payton and the front office believe is simply too good to pass up, you have to listen. McLaughlin and Skinner would probably be more difficult to move, but neither possibility can completely be ruled out, particularly if a team sitting low in the waiver order wants to guarantee it gets one of them. And now, this is where our second story makes the Troy Franklin situation even more interesting. Because Franklin hasn't just appeared in speculation about Denver's roster decisions, his name has also surfaced as a possible target for an AFC rival. And that's where I start asking a completely different question. Why would Denver want to help another AFC contender? Josh Buckhalter of Heavy looked at this situation and made the case that the Broncos, with Sean Payton positioning this team to be a threat in the AFC again, shouldn't be expected to willingly hand one of their offensive weapons to a direct conference competitor. And Franklin isn't the only name that has been discussed in trade speculation. Marvin Mims Jr. has been part of those conversations as well, and so has Pat Bryant. Now look at this receiver room. Courtland Sutton and Jalen Waddle are sitting at the top of the depth chart. Behind them, you've got Franklin, Mims, and Bryant. And that is exactly why this conversation becomes so fascinating. Because there's a major difference between saying Denver has enough receiver depth that somebody could potentially become available, and saying Denver should trade one of these guys to another AFC team that could be standing in its way later. Those are two completely different conversations. Sean Payton is trying to win. This team isn't building with the idea that maybe everything comes together 3 years from now. Denver believes it can compete in the AFC, so if another AFC contender calls asking about Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims Jr., or Pat Bryant, that price better reflect the fact that you might be strengthening a team you could eventually have to beat. And, with Mims specifically, we're talking about an all-pro returner. His value isn't limited to what he does as a receiver. That matters. Mims has also been dealing with an injury situation that led Denver to bring in Kyrie's Rowan, but that doesn't suddenly mean the Broncos should be looking to move Mims. Depth becomes even more valuable when injuries start entering the equation, and this is why I think these two stories actually tell us something important about where the Broncos are as a franchise right now. Denver has reached a point where some difficult roster decisions aren't happening because the roster has no answers. They're happening because there are too many players competing for a limited number of spots. That's a much better problem to have. But it still has to be handled correctly. You cannot become careless just because you have depth. If Troy Franklin isn't in your plans, find out what the league is willing to offer. If Jaleel McLaughlin is going to lose the numbers game behind J. Dobbins, RJ Harvey, and Jonah Coleman, make those calls before exposing him to waivers. If JL Skinner is squeezed out after the addition of Taylor Rapp and because of Devin Key's special teams value, see whether another organization needs what Skinner does best. But at the same time, don't start trading useful football players just because somebody offers you a late pick. And definitely don't make another AFC contender better unless the return makes sense for Denver. That's the balance Sean Payton and this front office have to find, and Troy Franklin is the perfect example. The first story tells us why Denver could theoretically consider trading him rather than risking losing him for nothing. The second tells us why we shouldn't automatically assume Denver actually wants him gone. Both things can be true. Denver can listen. Denver can evaluate offers. Denver can recognize Franklin has value around the league. And Denver can still decide that keeping him is more valuable than whatever another team puts on the table. That's what makes these final roster decisions so fascinating. Because once that 53-man roster is finalized, we're going to learn a lot about what Sean Payton actually values on this team. Not what we think he values. Not what somebody's roster projection says. What he actually values. And Broncos country, I want to know where you stand on this one. If another team comes calling for Troy Franklin, are you taking a draft pick and trusting Courtland Sutton, Jalen Waddle, Marvin Mims Jr., Pat Bryant, and the rest of this receiver room? Or are you keeping Franklin because you believe Denver needs all the offensive depth it can get for what could be a huge season? And what about Jaleel McLaughlin and JL Skinner? Would you take whatever reasonable value you can get rather than risk losing either one through waivers? Drop your opinion in the comments because these are exactly the conversations I love having with you guys. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're still building this Broncos community from the ground up, and our first goal is 1,000 subscribers. If you want daily Broncos content, real opinions, and a place where we can talk about this team like actual fans instead of pretending we don't get emotionally invested in every single decision they make, I'd love to have you here from the beginning. Because the roster is about to be set, the decisions are getting harder, and now we find out who Sean Payton truly believes deserves to be part of what Denver is building. Broncos country, we'll be watching every move.